Welcome, Marco. Over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. It's very nice to be here. So, what it is Kirigami? I will do a bit of introduction before to take it a bit larger. So, first thing I will start saying that desktop applications are not really what they used to be, in the sense that in the past years we are seeing new different designs for desktop applications as well, not only for mobile applications. There is a lot of, let's say, cross-pollination between the two. And also, we also see a difference in the rate of the changes that desktop applications are going into. This more like consumer-oriented, simple desktop applications like a file manager, a music player, a chat client. Those are becoming very flashy, if you want, very fancy and very influenced. Let's hope not too much, but influenced to a certain rate by mobile application. While different category, the very complex content creation oriented application are changing as well, but with maybe with a slower pace. Like in this screenshot, you can see Autodesk Fusion 360, a very complex CAD application that it's less weird. It does look less new, if you want, that than those like Slack, like Windows Fluent. How would they call it? Mail application like the new macOS Finder, but still, it does have experiments in its UI, like widget controls just melded in the 3D scene, which I think in the next year we will see the line between 3D engines and widget sets more and more blurry, I think. So nowadays, from a widget set, the user is expected to have more advanced display effects, smooth application, everything hardware accelerated, everything that makes use of the GPU to give an experience as fast and looking fancy, as smoother as possible. Windows and Mac in their native APIs are getting there. Of course, mobile platforms such as Flutter or the iOS platform are already there since a long time. But even desktop native APIs of the major desktop operating systems are slowly catching up. So what does Qt offers in the department of UI creation? One is represented by QWidget. QWidget is the offer that Qt has since a very, very long time. It served us very well for years. Since it's a so long evolution, it got to address so many corner cases then that make it very expressive for the domain of explicitly doing a desktop and a desktop only application. So what its strength, it's also kind of its weakness, because it's very good, but very good only on desktop. And while we have many many very complex and good applications. Let's just on the open source camp, let's think about Krita and FreeCAD, but there are also many commercial applications done in QWidget, which are very professional and very also on the content creation side. There are CAD applications, there are office suites, there are many kinds of design tools. However, there is a but. Nowadays, even if it's still awesome, QWidget kind of feels dated in a way. One reason is also because it's, at least from the Qt company, kind of considered done. So it meant that in the Qt 5 life cycle, it continued to receive updates, it continued to receive bug fixes, but didn't have many significant new feature or significant architectural changes done to it. So some of its quirkiness are really starting to be visible to the developer that wants to write a desktop application which also feels modern and in line with other offerings such as Flutter or whatever. The painting is still done mostly in software with the QPainter API, which is completely imperative, so cannot even be really well translated to the GPU, and also animations are done in software. So all of that can make complex graphics quite CPU intensive very, very quickly. Also, all the QWidget widgets, they clip their contents to the widget rectangle, which doesn't seem to be a particular serious issues, but even just on the theming, on the styling part, it makes things like wanting to do a push button which has drop shadows that goes outside of the widget. Very complex to do. Not impossible, but quite complex and a bit hacky. And last but not least, it's still kind of hostile to designers. It does have a graphical design tool in the form of Qt Designer, but that only helps in the sense to do the final layout of the application, but there is no good graphical tooling for designing animation, for designing custom widgets, for designing graphical effects that go onto widget. So it feels a bit early 2000s to not to say. To put it simply, Qt also has another graphical toolkit, which is called QML, which is the base, and then Qt Quick, which is its graphical part. That's where most of the work in Qt has went in the Qt 5 series. This is very good. I like it a lot. Not everybody loves it for some reasons that will be self-evident later. But it's definitely a step in the right direction. The Qt Quick components are drawn in an hardware accelerated scene graph, and language QML used to define the components. It's very easy and intuitive. Maybe not so much for people used to C++ APIs, but it tends to be really easy and intuitive for people which are coming from the HTML, CSS side of the world, and also the design-centric design tools like the Design Studio are getting better and are getting really nice to be used also by a designer, not only by a developer. However, on the QWidget part, there was a but, and there is a but also here. It kind of feels incomplete, especially on when developing a desktop application with it. Even after 10 years of development, because most of the development probably went more on the mobile and embedded use cases where it's really good. But also, I think because it wasn't a logical gradual evolution of the QWidget framework, but it kind of started from a blank slate, which is a good thing for, again, mobile and embedded, because you don't need and don't want any old legacy there. But on the desktop side, you end up with many, let's call it regressions. Just to put some concrete examples, for instance, its item views are quite limited, like list view and grid view. They have some performance problems. The more recent table view fixes some of that, but it's still not as powerful as it could be. Another example is that we still don't have a good tree view in Qt Quick and in Qt Quick Controls, which is something that's fairly useless for a mobile application, but it's pretty fundamental in many kinds of complex desktop applications. And another thing that I would really like, and it kind of limits using it for a complex desktop application, is that it's almost has no C++ API. There is some basic Qt Quick item and views and the engine to load the QML, but you don't have C++ API for the final controls, which, at least in the optic of writing a custom control, I think that would be really needed. To cite another one is that the pop-ups, the pop-up types are done in the same window, which is in the same window of the main application, which is a thing that you need in mobile, but it's kind of annoying for a desktop. Like for pop-up menus, imagine you have a window that partly goes over another window, and then you do a right click on the window that is slightly covered, and then the pop-up menu, you want it to go on top of everything, also cover the other window, but you cannot do it if you have your pop-ups in the same window. So we really hope that Qt 6 will fix it. And another thing that it seems that Qt 6 will fix it with QML3 is that there are still some performance problems. So it's it's way faster to paint and draw than QWidget, but in terms of memory footprint and speed of loading, mostly because it's completely interpreted and it comes with a JavaScript interpreted with it. You can have, if you are not really careful on how your code is structured, you can have some impact with the startup performance. So in KDE, we want to adopt QML as much as possible, but we felt that we needed more tools on top of it for making our life easier and for being able to make more powerful to things with QML. We need something more at the framework side. KDE offer many frameworks that if you are not familiar with them, check it out. There are some of them really useful on top of Qt. Kirigami is a Qt framework as well. Is a tier 1 framework. That means that it doesn't depend from other KDE frameworks, but only depends from things which are in Qt itself. It was Kirigami was born in the beginning for also to help us to port our application to mobile platforms, for Android, and to try to do our own mobile platforms as Plasma Mobile. But from the day one, it was obvious that in order to be able to do really powerful stuff and not to have to completely separate implementation of the same application, but to share also a bit of GUI between a desktop and a mobile application, we need to treat in our framework and in Kirigami, which extends QML and extends Qt Controls 2, to treat the desktop as a first-class citizen. I would still recommend it as everything in QML, mostly for more lightweight applications. Again, a music player, or a mail client, or a file manager, things like that. For more complex content creation application, especially if they exist already, if it's something to port, I would probably not suggest to just go all in QML yet, for the limitations that QML still has, but to do piece by piece, like the approach that we taken with the KDE system settings applications, the application that you use to set your fonts, your color scheme, and whatnot. We made quite some use of the QQuick widget, which is a Q widget which proxies a QML view, which by copying the textures of the window that renders off screen, but that there are behind the scene details. It can let you to mix Q widgets and QML in the same application and in the same window in the end. With system settings, we need it because we are starting to port to QML many setting modules, but not of them are ported yet. So we still need to be able to use the Q widgets one. We had some quirks and problems with QQuick widgets, which comes not without its problems, but like it needed some custom code for the tab key navigation to go in and then go out again of the Q widget. So to smoothly switch between the widgets done in QQuick and the widgets done in Qt widget by just pressing tab and hiding to you the implementation that were actually two different graphical systems. But all of that, it's kind of can be fixed and can be managed. Kirigami has been done in order to make easy writing application with a certain style, with a certain consistency, and with a certain user interface guideline. Because it has, among the components that it offers, it has very high level components, very abstract, that kind of force the application to have a certain layout. They kind of reintroduce some Q widget word style rigidity in the application. You don't have to use those, but especially in the case of the of the single hobby project application, where you don't have a designer following you every step. Having some rigidity, it actually helps, because Qt Quick, like most of the modern UI frameworks, since it gives you so much graphical freedom, it makes it also very easy to shoot yourself in the foot, especially if you are not a trained designer. So for a single person to start a like hobby project, I kind of suggest to still retain a framework that gives you some rigidity at the beginning, and then eventually going out of the boundaries afterwards. Besides those very high-level components, it also gives some more lower-level components that were missing in Qt Quick Controls 2, and we also felt that they were kind of still out of scope to Qt Quick Controls 2. Like we have a form layout, which I will talk a bit deeper with some code examples later. We have an icon that is just a control that shows icons that follow by name, that follow the free desktop theme specifications. We have cards that are in themselves a pretty popular component in the mobile world, but are becoming quite popular also in the desktop world. In the end, they are just glorified rounded rectangles with a drop shadow, and a thing which I really love. You can specify independently the rounded radius for all of four corners. I had to do that too many times by composing in weird ways multiple rectangles, and then using Qt Quick effects, which it seems it will even be deprecated in Qt 6. So this is a C++ based component. It just paints with a couple of shaders. It's also really efficient. We also have a standard about page because all applications by KDE, they all have an about dialogue that is the same for everybody. So now we can have that also for QML-based stuff. It also gives toolbars, which are action-based, which has some reminiscence, something taken from a KDE framework called KXML GUI that does also, which is completely widget oriented. It does much more things, but I think that I really love that it does. It's specifying in a semantic way actions for an application, which are then kind of disconnected for their graphical representation. So you can have a list of action and say, do it as a toolbar or do it as a menu. It doesn't change, and it doesn't need reimplementation of parts. Let's start with some example code. I hope it's readable here in the slide. This is an example application that it's really simple. It's just a window with a sidebar on the left and a main area on the right, which has a toolbar with some actions and a big list view, which is dummy, and which could be anything like your files in the file system or whatever. So the base class here, the root element is kirigami.application window. That is just a subclass of Qt Quick Controls 2 application window. It adds some properties to it, global drawer and context drawer. Those drawers are those things that you find in mobile applications that you trigger by swiping left or right. A drawer comes up like in the Gmail app, you swipe and the list of, I believe, labels and folders, email folders comes up. You don't have to use them. You want to use them mostly on the mobile case, but if you decide to use them in the desktop case, since a swipe gesture doesn't make any sense on desktop, those can become normal sidebars. That's as people are used to in desktop applications. Then the page stack is the component which is internal in the application window, but you don't have to use application window, that manages all the life cycle of the main application pages. So like mobile applications, here the application content is defined as pages that can be replaced in and out as you want. And the application, the individual pages, as you can see here, they also can have a list of actions, and those actions on the desktop side, those actions on the desktop case will be represented like a toolbar, auto-generated. While on the mobile case, they will end up in one of those side drawers. In our case, swiping from the right part, while the global part that was the sidebar, then it gets sliding on the left part. So this window running on the desktop with the Plasma Breeze style, and this window running on mobile with the Android Material style are exactly the same code. There is no change has been done. So you can see that at least some automatic convergence is there. You will still have to do different code between the desktop and mobile use case, unless your application is really, really simple. But there is a lot of headaches that Kirigami will be the one that managing it. Another way to have an application with a sidebar is by using the base paradigm of the standard kind of cookie cutter Kirigami application, which will be valid for some application, not valid for other applications. But as everything in Kirigami, in QML, everything is optional. You don't have to use it. So basically, we have our main application window that has a kind of stack of pages pushed one on top of each other, but represented in a horizontally scrolling long row of pages. On the desktop side, on the desktop case, you usually want to have only two of those pages, one acting as a sidebar and one acting as the main content. On the mobile case, if would be often those applications will be more oriented to drill down in multiple level of lists. Every page will take the whole screen, and you can have a breadcrumb on top that tells you where you are in the navigation. But for the desktop case, you usually want to have one page to be always as like the main content of the application, and one as the sidebar. You can also have this kind of horizontal scrolling only for the sidebar. It would be useful, for instance, in a mail application. The API in Kirigami to use that is either all automatically in application window, if you use that. Otherwise, in the page row components to be instantiated manually. This page row component has API for managing lifecycle to push and pop pages if the pages that you are pushing are either a QML file name or a QML component. Then it will take care of instantiating it and then killing it when it's not needed anymore. Or you can also use its base class, which is called column view, which is just doesn't have this automatic life cycle managing, but it just manages the layout of the horizontal scrolling row of pages. Okay, so a final word on toolbars. We've seen that the toolbars, they can be created automatically by the page, and it's nice in this case if your application or that page of the application is supposed to be present more both in the desktop and in the mobile use cases, because what was a toolbar now becomes a drawer that can be shown by a swipe action, with the main action becoming a floating action button, the thing that it's used a lot in Android. But you can also use those toolbars instantiated by hand. The component is called Action Toolbar. So by default, this thing just does a horizontal row of tool buttons that one for each action, one tool button gets instantiated. And when you resize your window, since the toolbar can be too big, then the tool buttons on the right then they start to be hidden and then end up in a pop-up menu that can be triggered by that kebab menu, they call it, that appears on the end of the toolbar. The actions, you not always having just tool buttons in a toolbar is enough. Sometimes you need custom controls, so the action can have a delegate property. If a delegate component is defined in an action, then that component will be instantiated and used as the action representation. I have a few other classes to quickly show some code examples in the end, especially for form layout. This is kind of important because in KDE we ended up using this component really a lot because the form layout QWidget does have one. Is used a lot for the settings windows of an application. So if you are doing a QML desktop application, you want to have a similar layout, you can kind of replicate it with a grid layout. In fact, my form layout in Kirigami is based on top of a grid layout, but it's not quite enough. You need to have labels aligned in a certain way and maybe aligned in different ways depending on the platforms. And then you have the concept in form layouts of the body, So what is the concept of the body? So the main input fields in a form layout can have a label on the left. This label can export a keyboard shortcut. So if you press Alt, and at least in a Plasma environment, you see all the relevant letters, like here, the relevant letters in the labels that gets underlined. So for the first field, I will press Alt L, and then the corresponding input field will be focused, not the label, because the focus on a label doesn't make sense. So in order to make it very, very simple to do a form layout, in Kirigami, you just instantiate one, and then just instantiate the main widgets, the main fields that the form layout will contain, not the labels. For the labels, you use an attached property called form data, attached property. So you specify, like here, form data.labels is a label, and then that will pop up. You don't have to instantiate a label. You don't have to manually set anchors to have the layout properly aligned with the labels all right aligned. The layout will take care of it for you. You can also see here in the last example that we override the automatic body for this label, and we want the third radio button, not the first, as it would be the default. So the label gets positioned besides that third button, and if I trigger this label, it will focus this third button and not the first one. In our very long work of porting all the system settings application in Plasma, we are using this layout over and over and over again. So it has been really useful for us. Not everything that we use on top of QML to make it more powerful for the desktop is implemented in Kirigami. Also because I want to keep it reasonably small and minimal, and also keep it a tier 1 framework, so we cannot use other KDE frameworks. But there are other KDE frameworks that are very useful, and not all of them, but some of them are also very useful to be used in QML. So we are starting to put QML bindings in the frameworks as well. Usually the QML bindings go in the Git repository of the framework itself. A good example is a framework called K-item models, which is a useful series of proxy models, because as sometimes is said, there is no problem in the world that cannot be solved by a good stack of proxy models, right? So, for instance, we have a concatenate rows proxy model. You have two models, but you just want one view that shows the items for both models. First one and then the others. We have a proxy for that, and one which has been a slight repurposing of it has been really useful lately is K-descendant proxy model. So what K-descendant proxy model does? It takes a QAbstract item model that may be tree shaped, and it flattens it as a pure list without subtrees. The standard QML item views don't support trees, so this was already quite useful. but still we want 3 views. So we added in K-descendant proxy model kind of a new functionality that allows us to collapse the nodes of the tree. So in Qt API means collapse certain QAbstract indexes. And if you set the model to be completely collapsed as default, you can basically have a tree view on top of that, because you could do a tree view by nesting repeaters. This would be horribly inefficient, because if you load a very heavy model, it could like literally make your app explode. For instance, we have a model in KDE framework called KDIR model, which represent your whole file system. And if you point it at your root directory, then having just nested repeaters makes the model list every single file in the system. With a K-descendant proxy model, all collapsed by default. It will completely ignore all the subtrees, so it will not ask to list the folder in a nested way, and it will do a kind of lazy loading. It will do that only if then you command to expand a particular node, and then just at that moment it will list the folders that are under that item. A bit of a code example, we also did some graphical elements for it. Since they are graphical elements and the framework is called K-item models, the graphical elements were put in different frameworks, in a different framework. So we did on form of Kirigami add-ons that are a series of frameworks that they do extra things that Kirigami does, and they can depend on extra frameworks that Kirigami cannot depend. We added the tree view. Most important components in it are the tree list view and tree table view. Those two things are just proxying the base QML types list view and table view, but they are creating a K-descendant proxy model behind the scenes. So then you assign as a model a tree model, and it will do the magic behind you. And then we also have, very important, a basic delegate that has the decoration part of the view. So the little expander buttons that will expand and collapse the subtree item on click, and the tree lines that can be, also those can be styled by the platform style. Styling by the platform style, this to change, slight change of topic again. The last piece of the puzzle that we're missing to make Qt Quick Controls 2 application really at home in a desktop is having the styling of the native application. For now, we did a style in its own framework. It's called QQC2 Desktop Style. It uses a fork of a component that was present in Qt Quick Controls 1, which is a component that draws selected widget items that you want using just QStyle as application. So it can paint for you a button that looks completely like a Qt push button, but there is no Qt push button instance anywhere. It just paints it. Unfortunately, it has all the limitations that Qt Quick Controls 1 had, because using QStyle, then it depends from QWidgets, so your application needs to be a link into QWidget, and the base application instance must be a Q application rather than a QGUI application. For Qt 6, they are doing also a QStyle fork with that doesn't depend on QWidget at all anymore. That could be interesting, could be useful. Unfortunately, it seems that that one will stay private, so not really usable for third-party desktop platforms like Plasma. But in the end, we probably need some new way to style widgets that doesn't have any more the limitations of QStyle and the limitations of QPainter. We'll see in the future if we can do some kind of meta theme engine that a QStyle could use that meta theme to paint, but also the Qt Quick Control style would use the same meta theme to paint but it's in its own SIGGRAPH friendly ways. And with this last piece of the puzzle, that's all. So in KDE, we are starting to have several applications written in QML using Kirigami, also on the desktop, like the Discover Package Manager, like also some Plasma Shell parts, like I already mentioned, the system settings application. It's slowly migrating everything in QML. There are still things that I wish there were different in developing applications in QML. There are still some things that I would like to improve, but hopefully Qt 6 will solve most of them. Like public C++ API for components. It seems that it's already planned. The startup performance problems could be solved by QML 3, which makes JavaScript less necessary for doing a QML application. And the old problem of pop-ups not being windows. Also, that I heard that in Qt 6 they are trying to address that. For the Qt 5 lifecycle, I have some ideas. I have some prototypes to do with the stock dialog and pop-up components in QML, doing a separate window. Prototypes kind of work, but we have to be really, really wary about not introducing weird behavior changes or corner cases that could break a random application, since we are writing a framework ideally to be used by everyone. So it will need more experimenting, but it's something to be really wary of. And with that was it. Here there are some ways you can know more about it. We have also Kirigami Telegram channel. As well, we have a Kirigami Matrix channel. They are mirrored by between themselves, so you can use both of them. Thank you very much, everyone, for attending. And if there are questions, I will be happy to answer.
Thank you very much. Interesting stuff indeed. Am I entirely wrong if I tonight, when I tell my wife about this presentation today, if I paraphrase it to Kirigami is what is missing in Qt Quick 2 to be a complete widget library for the desktop?
Yes, it surely attempts to be that. And yes, it's something that tries to make desktop development with Qt Quick a bit easier. And yeah, trying to provide the missing parts.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. The reason for that question is really the follow-up question. So in my young days, when I was a KDE developer, there was a lot of stuff in KDE that made all the application look and behave the same. I assume that Kirigami is for QML trying to at least help us somewhere way down that road. But
yeah,
still,
it kind of tries to do the same. We're trying to keep it a tier 1 framework, kind of to avoid the early KDE libs problem that wanting to use one thing, you had to have a lot of stuff that you didn't use coming with you. So in Kirigami itself, there are all the parts that we can do without other KDE frameworks. And then other parts will be scattered between the various KDE frameworks for the necessary QML bindings that you would need to use that framework.
Okay. What is the licensing?
The licensing is the same as all the other KDE frameworks, so it's LGPL v2 plus.
Okay.
Except the styling, the QQC2 desktop style. That one, since it contains a fork of a piece from Qt, then that one has to be GPL v3. But that's just a runtime dependency, and it's not necessary.
Okay. So that means that if I'm a commercial software vendor that wants to write a desktop application, Kirigami would be a possible choice for me to get a head start on that.
Yeah, if you are okay by using LGPL v2 libraries, then that's fine.
Okay. Do you have any known customers already, or whatever I would call them, any known users that you can?
Kind of. There is an application that is called Pure Maps.
Okay.
It's a mapping application that has a version for Selfish OS, a version for GNOME, and a version for like Plasma Mobile kind of thing. The developer is mostly a GNOME user, so he also helped me a bit in some integrating pieces that were missing. Like I see this standard icon, it's missing in GNOME. How can we make sure it also falls back correctly to the GNOME icon theme and things like that? So,
okay. Sean is asking, what are your thoughts about Maui? From what he remembers, he writes it's based on Kirigami.
Yeah, Maui is based on Kirigami.
Can you just, for the rest of us, give us an idea what Maui is?
So it's another framework written in QML. It partly overlaps in scope with Kirigami. It has much more components. Their philosophy is more having everything we could need, even if this will come with some more dependencies. I constantly talk with the main Maui developer, Camilo. He's also in the Kirigami channel. He also tries, when there is a Maui component that we agree that is would be good for everyone, then he tries to upstream it into Kirigami. That there are several contributions by him already. So MAUI, it's something more to give components for having more wild experiments, more, and having applications that are more gathered to the design language of their Nitrux platform. So it's kind of complementary. It's a thing on top of it that also that one I think works on Android as well. It offers it has a slightly different design language, so it's good. There is choice between those things, and it offers more experimental components. So yeah, you can take a look at that as well.
Okay. Here's a question from Stan, who obviously was in the presentation a few days ago on Linux, or Windows Subsystem Linux. His question is, will Kirigami work via Windows Subsystem Linux, you think?
Yes. So if any Qt application works, then Kirigami will work. As I said, as a basis, we try to depend only on Qt. So Kirigami can already work on Windows. There are some applications that are distributing Windows executables already, like Peruse, which is a comic book reader. They did some Windows release as well. About Windows Subsystem for Linux, if you did manage to make Qt run on it, then Kirigami will just run.
And I can confirm that Qt runs just fine on that.
Yep.
Here's a question from George, who obviously is an old-time KDE dude, because he remembers the good old days of KXML GUI. Is there any plans in Kirigami?
I would like to. I'm still not sure if Kirigami is the right framework or a kind of modernized QML-oriented KXML GUI equivalent should be probably its own framework. But the way that I did toolbars to be based as much on action as possible was kind of in a vision of eventually allowing something like that in the future, which, yeah, customizable toolbars are still one of the things that are missing in QML. You can do that, but with a lot of custom work, a component that just like does that would be really nice. Yes.
Okay. You mentioned several times throughout your presentation that these problems will be solved with Qt 6, and hope it's evergreen. Yes, indeed. But that leads me to the follow-up question. If I have an application and I'm not ready to go to Qt 6 for whatever reason now, and I want to rely on or use Kirigami in my as part of my solution, what are my options?
So, for using Qt 6, I think it will take a long time. It's in heavy development now, and probably also 6.0. It's something to probably will be something not release final products on yet. Right now, I would say, first of all, assess what is the type of the application that you are writing. If you are starting from scratch, I would probably say use QML. If your application is kind of content consumption oriented, like a chat application, like an image viewer, things like that, I say use QML. Use Kirigami if you want, without hesitation. if you are starting to port an old and very big QWidget application, I would say start doing piece by piece. As also as the news score guy told yesterday, they also started to basically follow that approach to take apart maybe as a sidebar of your application that you want to be a bit more fancy, port it to QML and use a QQuick widget. As I mentioned in the presentation, doesn't come with. It does also come with its own quirks, but they are solvable. It's also what we did for our system settings. So we started to port to QML, but we still had to support the QWidget versions at the same time. So system settings now have a couple of QQuick widgets, and the widget of the main configuration module can be swapped out live with a QWidget based if the configuration module that you are accessing doesn't support it. And as a beginning for porting big things, I would say use this way.
Okay, I'm not. Thank you very much for that answer. That's very useful. But I think that answered my question, though. So my question is, if I buy a piece of software now relying on Kirigami, what are my options going forward regarding to Qt 5 and Qt 6? Do I need to follow you to Qt 6 before I'm ready for it, or will there be a transition period of some kind where?
So KDE frameworks and Kirigami as well will be supported with Qt 5 for quite a long time still. Also, because to really say we cannot support KDE Framework 5 anymore means that internally in the KDE project there is no Qt 5 application left, and that will take years by itself. And then still to be good citizens for all the Qt 5 life cycle and for, I guess, at least a couple of years, we will provide updates, we will provide bug fixes, with the still with the promise of keeping retrocompatibility as much as possible. And even when we will do a Qt 6 version, at least personally, I didn't really start yet to look in Kirigami in Qt 6, so it's a bit early, but we plan to not break compatibility too much, to not break the API too much, to do transitions as smooth as possible without too much pain.
Okay, Marco, thank you very much for an interesting presentation.
Okay, thank you very much. Bye.
Bye-bye.